The fluorescent lights hummed like insects trapped in plastic shells, and Laura Bennett moved through them the way she moved through most things now, with a kind of invisibility that came from never taking up space, never asking questions, never letting anyone remember you'd been there. She wore the scrubs like armor and kept her eyes angled slightly down, not quite submissive, more like someone counting steps on a familiar path. The pediatric ICU at St. Michael's in Colorado Springs smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, something she recognized from 18 years of medical training, the particular metallic tang of a child's fear mixed with medication and the kind of air that came through industrial ventilation systems that had processed 1,000 quiet emergencies. Her shift started at 6 in the morning. It was now 6:27. She'd already been to 3 rooms. The limp favoring her left leg was barely visible if you weren't looking for it, and most people weren't. The scar tissue underneath her left kneecap ran from her patella to her tibia in a pattern that only someone who'd been trained to recognize blast fragmentation would understand. It had been 13 months since the Pentagon erased Captain Laura Bennett from the Kandahar province roster. 13 months since she'd signed documents she wasn't allowed to read, spoken to lawyers she wasn't allowed to remember, and taken a job at a hospital where nobody knew her name meant anything at all. The locker in the break room held 3 things: an empty coffee mug with a faded sailboat on it, a dying succulent she'd never been able to kill completely, and a folded American flag in a triangle of plastic that she kept tucked behind her spare shoes. The flag had arrived 14 months ago. No explanation. No return address. Just the weight of it in her hands, the weight of a man who had been standing where she was supposed to be standing, doing the job she was supposed to be doing, when something underground erupted and changed the definition of home forever. She told herself not to touch it before her shifts. It never worked. Room 304 had a name on the chart: Mitchell. Age 8. Diagnosis: incomplete spinal cord injury, T for compression fracture, post-vehicular trauma, 3 weeks post-admission. The monitors around his bed created a constellation of green and red numbers that she read the way other people read faces. BP holding steady. O2 at 96. Heart rate elevated but stable. The boy's eyes were open, tracking her as she entered, and the look in them made something in her chest move that she'd trained herself not to feel anymore. "Good morning, buddy," she said, her voice dropping into the register she used for sedated children and the dying. Soft. No false brightness. The kind of voice that said she would not lie to him. "I'm going to check your line here. You might feel a little cool water." She wiped the foresight with alcohol, the smell of it sharp and specific, cutting through the other hospital smells, and she felt the boy's eyes on her like a physical thing. Not the blank stare of a sedated child. This was something else. This was recognition, and it made her hands pause for exactly 1.3 seconds before she continued, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought needed to stop. The chart said his father was a Navy captain named Mitchell. The chart said the accident had been vehicular, a collision at an intersection near Monument Valley Park, 3 weeks ago, no other vehicles involved, which meant the chart was wrong about something it couldn't begin to measure. She'd learned to read hospital charts for what they didn't say. This one was screaming. "Easy," she whispered. "I've got you." The boy's mouth opened like he was going to speak, but the sedation lines in his face held him back, and she made a decision with her eyes alone, a quick shake of her head that said, "Not now, not where they can hear, not while we're both still being watched." His pupils dilated slightly. He understood. She finished the vitals check, logged everything into the system with the kind of attention to detail that Dr. Pierce watched for during rounds like a hawk watches for movement in tall grass, and she was turning to leave when the footsteps started coming down the corridor. She recognized the rhythm of them: Pierce's shoes, Italian leather, expensive soles that clicked against the tile in a pattern that meant he was in a hurry or in a mood, possibly both. Behind him came another set of footsteps, quieter, professional, the kind of walk a pharmaceutical rep learned to master, present but unobtrusive, hovering just outside the doctor's circle of authority. She was past the doorway when Pierce's voice caught her. "Bennett." 3 things happened in her brain simultaneously: acknowledgement, evaluation, and the decision to turn around as if she'd been expecting to be called. Not surprised. Not deferential. Just competent and available, which was the highest compliment she allowed herself these days. Dr. Pierce was tall, silver at the temples, the kind of handsome that came from knowing exactly how much he was worth and having made peace with that number decades ago. His eyes were the color of winter sky, and they moved across her the way a butcher's eyes move across a side of beef, assessing yield. Behind him stood a man in a charcoal suit, pharmaceutical logo embroidered on the left pocket in gold thread, smile calibrated to exactly the right angle of confidence without arrogance. "Rounds in 5 minutes, Pierce said. "You're on Mitchell's case today, correct?" "Yes, sir." "T4 compression, progressing well. Vitals stable." "Good. Then you won't have any problem explaining your charting from 3 days ago." He didn't ask it as a question. He said it like he already knew the answer and was testing to see if she was stupid enough to disagree. "I found a notation regarding medication administration that doesn't match the pharmacy log." Curious discrepancy. The boy in room 304 was listening to every word through the open doorway. She didn't look at him. Looking at him would be a tell. "I can walk you through the charting, doctor. Every entry matches protocol." "I'm sure it does," Pierce said, and the smile he gave her had teeth in it, but his eye stayed on her for exactly 2 more seconds before he turned to the pharmaceutical rep. "Let's talk about the fentanyl protocol in your car. I think we've found an interesting opportunity for optimization." They walked past without waiting for her response, and she stood in the hallway with her hands at her sides, listening to the sound of their voices fade toward the elevator, listening to the boy in room 304 breathing through his oxygen mask, listening to the fluorescent lights hum their electric prayer overhead. She was 6 steps from the break room when her phone buzzed, a secured line, the kind of number she wasn't supposed to have anymore, the kind that made her hands move before her brain could catch up. She stepped into the supply closet instead of the break room, locked the door, and read the message without opening it. The message disappeared 3 seconds after she read it. No trace. No way to respond. No way to tell whoever sent it that she was already standing in a hospital with a child whose father had died doing her job, whose son was looking at her with the kind of recognition that meant someone in a Pentagon office had built a file thick enough to connect dots that were supposed to stay separate forever. She touched the doorframe to steady herself, cool metal under her palm, the texture of 1,000 other people's fear sweat that had dried there and been wiped away and accumulated again. The supply closet smelled like latex and disinfectant. She could hear the heart monitors from the rooms beyond the wall, that particular beeping rhythm that meant everything was still working, still holding, still balanced on the edge of breaking. "Okay," she whispered to no one at all. What happened next didn't just change the morning. It changed everything. She opened the supply closet door and walked back toward the nurse's station, and when she passed room 304 again, the boy's eyes were still open, still tracking her with the ancient knowing of a child who'd already learned too much about loss. She didn't look at him. Not yet. But she made a note on her hand, small, invisible, the kind of thing that could be explained as a reminder about a medication time or a patient appointment. It was really the moment she decided that the Pentagon could erase her file, bury her rank, burn her unit designation from every official record. But they couldn't make her stop being what she was. And that boy, with his shattered spine and his dead father and his eyes that knew things no 8-year-old should know, he needed someone who understood what it meant to survive something that was supposed to kill you. Dr. Pierce could have no idea who he was talking to when he dismissed her in the hallway. He couldn't possibly understand that the woman he'd tested, the nurse he'd tried to intimidate, had spent for years learning to move silently through hostile terrain, learning to turn pain into information, learning to keep people alive under circumstances where every rule in a hospital manual became the thing that killed you fastest. She had 7 minutes to pull up the fentanyl protocols and understand exactly what discrepancy Dr. Pierce had been referencing. 7 minutes to figure out what medication was being ordered in suspicious quantities. 7 minutes to decide whether she was going to keep her head down, invisible, untouched by the machinery that had already tried to erase her once. The boy in room 304 coughed. She didn't turn around, but she heard it, the sound of a child struggling against sedation and pain and the particular helplessness of being 8 years old and knowing that your father wasn't coming back. That his replacement had come instead, and that replacement had stepped on a piece of earth that made him disappear. She thought about the folded flag in her locker. She thought about the name on her father's memorial plaque, not the one on his grave, but the one at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, the one that was officially classified and therefore didn't exist. She thought about the meditation instructor in her trauma therapy who'd said, invisibility is not the same as safety, and she'd walked out of that appointment and never gone back because the instructor was wrong. Invisibility had kept her alive. Invisibility was the only thing that worked. But invisibility, she was beginning to understand, came with a cost. She pulled up the medication logs on the computer at the nurse's station, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory and training, and she started to read the numbers that weren't supposed to connect. They connected anyway. Thursday morning arrived with the precision of a guillotine blade. 12 residents and attending physicians crowded into the conference room at St. Michael's, their laptops open, their coffee cups steaming, their attention divided until Dr. Pierce pulled up the projection screen. Laura stood against the back wall in her scrubs, hands folded, spine straight. She'd learned in Kandahar that you never announce your presence. You become part of the wall. The screen lit up. Her charting. 3 weeks of documentation, magnified for an audience. Nurse Bennett's work, Dr. Pierce said, his voice carrying the casual contempt of a man who'd never been told no. Notice the timestamps. She's spending approximately 92 minutes per patient per shift. The standard protocol is 45. Nearly double. He tapped the screen with a stylus. His tailored suit caught the fluorescent light. This is what happens when protocols aren't followed. Economics matter, people. Every extra minute is a cost center. Some nurses understand the business model of modern medicine. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, where a pharmaceutical rep in a charcoal blazer stood pretending to review charts. Others struggle with the concept. The residents shifted. One whispered to another. Laura felt their eyes, not cruel, just assessing. The new nurse who didn't understand efficiency. The outlier. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She breathed. 2 hours later, the vending machine hummed its eternal mechanical song in the break room. Laura punched in her code for water. Bottled, cold, the kind that came with no obligation. Dr. Pierce materialized with 2 residents trailing like pilot fish, his voice pitched loud enough to carry. Did Nurse Bennett even finish nursing school? His smile was surgical. I've reviewed some of her early charting. Veterinary technicians have better credentials. The residents laughed, not meanly, just following the leader's cue. One was barely old enough to shave. We have standards here. Excellence, not just presence. Laura selected her water bottle. The machine released it with a mechanical sigh. She twisted the cap, brought it to her lips, felt the cold shock of it. In her peripheral vision, a single tear had escaped. She could feel it tracking down her left cheek like a traitor. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with her own reflection in the vending machine's glass, watching herself remain absolutely still while a man dismantled her in front of an audience that was already forgetting her name. Pierce stepped closer. The residents drifted away, sensing something shift in the room's air pressure. His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear, the kind that penetrates bone without traveling far. Security could escort you out today if I make one phone call. Right now. No notice. Your references won't check out, I've already started making inquiries with your prior employers. His breath smelled like coffee and something else. Certainty. You have a job because I've allowed it. That tolerance ends whenever I decide it ends. She turned to face him fully. Their eyes met. His were the color of polished ice, and just as empty. Her voice came out steady as surgical steel. I've been escorted out of worse places by better men. His face flushed red, actual crimson climbing up his neck like a thermometer. He recovered fast. The rage transformed into something colder. Insubordination noted. That's your second write-up this month, Nurse Bennett. One more and we move to termination proceedings. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over his contacts. I have documentation. I have witnesses. I have administrative authority. He said it like a prayer, like reciting back something that had been promised to him. Don't test what I can do. He walked out. Laura stood motionless for exactly 42 seconds. Then she put the water bottle on the counter untouched and returned to the ICU. Room 304 had a 7-year-old in it, no, 8 now. She'd checked his chart again this morning. Captain Marcus Mitchell's son, Thomas, with the shattered spine that doctors said would never function the way it should. The boy was asleep, but his eyes opened when she entered, the way children do with nurses. He watched her with a gravity that didn't belong in an 8-year-old face. His father dozed in the chair beside the bed, dress uniform jacket draped over the armrest, ribbons visible on the chest, Navy medals catching the LED lights above the sink. The father had come straight from some ceremony. He hadn't showered. He smelled like cologne and something underneath. Fear. Laura checked the monitors. Thomas's oxygen saturation was steady. His heart rate appropriate for sleep. She adjusted his blanket, soft, thermal, the kind pediatrics used because children should have softness, at least somewhere, and the boy's small hand moved, found her wrist, held it. "Thank you," he whispered. She nodded once. Didn't speak. Some moments don't need language. She worked the overnight shift, the ICU settling into its nighttime rhythm, a place where time moved differently. Faster when things were bad. Slower when things were stable. The ventilators provided a baseline hum, mechanical breaths that were somehow less threatening than the alternative. At 11:17 p.m., Laura pulled up the pharmacy logs on the computer at the station. Her fingers moved with precision. The medication requisitions were there. She already knew the pattern, but seeing it in complete sequence was different. It was seeing the skeleton of something that should never exist. Certain medications. Quantities that couldn't match the current patient census. Authorization codes routing through Dr. Pierce's department. She photographed each page with her personal phone, 3 photos, perfectly framed, and the numbers were all there. Clear. Incriminating. She downloaded the quarterly reports showing spikes that aligned exactly with pharmaceutical rep visits. The rep's name was visible on the authorization forms. Kickbacks in the margins, if you knew how to read margins. She emailed the files to her personal account at 11:34 p.m., standard HIPAA compliant, patient names redacted, only the patterns visible, only the numbers that proved the theft. The hospital system flagged the transfer immediately. Dr. Pierce's phone buzzed in his home office at 11:36 p.m. He was already awake because men like him never truly sleep. They rest, like crocodiles rest. He read the alert, Nurse Bennett accessing restricted files, external data transfer detected, and he understood exactly what she had photographed. He made for calls in sequence, voice-controlled and precise. First to the hospital director, "We have a security breach. Confidential data transferred externally. I recommend immediate system shutdown and investigation." Second to his board allies, "The Bennett situation is developing. I'm handling it, but I wanted you aware." Third to IT, "Restrict all system access for Nurse Bennett, effective immediately. Flag all her devices. Any additional transfers trigger automatic lockout and alert protocols." Fourth to the pharmaceutical rep, "We have a problem. The new nurse just photographed the logs. She's documenting the pattern. We need to move quickly." By 12:43 a.m., Laura's hospital credentials were locked. She couldn't access the computer system. She couldn't pull up charts. She couldn't log medication administration. She was still a nurse in scrubs, but she wasn't a nurse in any way that mattered to the institution. Dr. Pierce had begun executing the calculations. At 1:02 a.m., she checked on Thomas again. His breathing sounded different. Shallower. She watched his chest wall, the asymmetrical movement, the effort it was taking, the way his small ribs worked to pull air in. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 86%. 84%. She increased the oxygen flow. Adjusted the nasal cannula. The saturation climbed back up, but the effort remained. The breathing pattern was wrong. Something inside was collapsing. His father shifted in the chair, still asleep, exhausted in the way only parents of dying children understand. The dress uniform caught the light again. She could see the medals now, purple ones, the color that meant blood. The medals of someone who had survived things that were supposed to kill him, who had come home incomplete in ways that don't show up on X-rays, who was now watching his own child suffer in a way he couldn't fix. Thomas's small hand reached up. Found her fingers. His lips moved. "Phoenix," he whispered. Just that word. Just her call sign. Laura's hand froze on the 4 line. Every muscle in her body locked. The word hung in the air like a bullet suspended mid-trajectory. Thomas's eyes were closing again, but they'd been awake for just long enough to say something impossible. He couldn't know that name. There was no way. That call sign was locked in classified files that hadn't existed publicly for 4 years. Nobody on this hospital staff knew it. Nobody except. The monitor alarm screamed. 2:07 a.m. Thomas's oxygen saturation plummeted. 80. 75. His chest wall movement became frantic, desperate, the movement of a child who couldn't breathe. Laura moved. Her hands already knew what to do before her conscious mind caught up. Muscle memory. Training. The kind of response that lives in your nervous system after you've done it enough times, when you've already seen enough children's lungs collapse from pressure they shouldn't have to endure. She called for backup. The night team appeared, 2 nurses, a resident, the attending who'd been sleeping in the on-call room. Laura was already moving Thomas, already assessing, already reading the asymmetry. Tension pneumothorax. His right lung collapsing. Air accumulating in the pleural space, pressure building, suffocating him from inside. 14-gauge angiocath, she said. Crisp. No question mark. Not a request. An order. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. The resident hesitated. That hesitation lasted 1 second too long, and that second was all it took for Laura to realize they were waiting for Dr. Pierce. For authority. For permission. She didn't wait. Hands steady as surgical lasers. Skin prepped. The needle went in at the precise angle. The hiss of air escaping, the sound of pressure releasing, of a child getting to breathe again, of systems rebalancing. The monitor stabilized. 88. 92. 96. Get a chest tube, she said. Call thoracic. Get Dr. Pierce on the phone and tell him we're moving this patient. The resident finally moved, and Laura stepped back, still holding the angiocath steady, her eyes on the monitor climbing toward normal while outside in the hallway, the night watch was already calling Dr. Pierce's phone. He would arrive in exactly 8 minutes. He would see what she had done. He would understand that she had just saved his access to the Mitchell boy, his continued connection to the pharmaceutical rep's schedule, his ability to move freely through a hospital where nobody was asking questions. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She breathed. And the monitor held steady at 98. The monitor held steady at 98. Laura's hands were still moving when the code team burst through the doors, Dr. Reeves shouting orders before he'd even crossed the threshold. She stepped back, let them have the space, but her eye stayed on Thomas Mitchell's chest, the rise and fall no longer labored, the color returning to his small face like a photograph developing. His father gripped the bed rail, knuckles white, breathing the way people do when they've just survived something they didn't know was happening. "What did you do?" Captain Mitchell's voice cracked. Not a question. Recognition. Laura didn't answer. She was already moving toward the medication cart, documenting the decompression needle she'd used, the exact time, the vital sign response. Protocol. Always protocol. It was the one thing they couldn't take from her, the habit of bearing witness to what actually happened, written down where people with the authority to care would have to see it. The ICU settled back into its rhythm. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical breathing. Monitors beeped in their steady patterns, each ping a small mercy, a patient still here, still fighting. 2:47 a.m. The shift had 7 more hours, and Laura moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost who'd learned to be useful, checking lines, adjusting drips, replacing the saline bag on Thomas's with movements so practiced they looked effortless. Most people didn't understand that effortlessly was just 10,000 hours of repetition compressed into muscle memory. The Navy had taught her that. The ICU reinforced it. She was at the pharmacy terminal at 3:15, the hallway empty except for the hum of the refrigeration units, when she noticed it. The methadone order for room 312 showed 5 milliliters dispensed on Tuesday. But room 312 had been empty on Tuesday, pediatric oncology patient discharged on Monday. The methadone should have been returned to stock. Instead, it was logged as administered. Laura pulled up the medication administration record. No signature. No timestamp. No documentation of who gave it or to whom. She frowned, cross-referenced room 310. Same pattern. Morphine, logged as given, but the patient was sedated and intubated, vital signs stable, pain management was being handled by the epidural, not for push. No reason for the additional opioid load. Laura's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling pharmacy records for the past 6 weeks. The pattern multiplied. Tuesday had 6 discrepancies. Thursday had 7. Wednesdays were quieter, 2, sometimes 3. Pain was information. That's what they taught you in tactical medicine. You read pain like a diagnostic tool, understood what it was telling you about the body underneath. Laura was reading the hospital's pain now, and it was screaming. She pulled up the visitor logs. Dr. Pierce's pharmaceutical rep, a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit named Harrison, always carrying a leather portfolio, had logged visits on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Sometimes Wednesdays. The pattern aligned exactly with the medication discrepancies. Laura opened a separate window, began cross-referencing the dates against Pierce's shift schedule. On days when Harrison visited, Pierce stayed late. On days when the rep didn't come, the orders normalized. The math was simple. Dangerous. And absolutely clear. Kickback schemes worked like gravity, they pulled things toward the ground if you didn't have something heavy enough to hold them up. The hospital's pharmacy checks, the DEA oversight, the state board audits, all of those were designed to catch exactly this kind of pattern. But patterns only surfaced if someone was looking for them, if someone's attention to detail was rigid enough to notice that 5 milliliters didn't match a patient who wasn't there anymore. Laura was the kind of person who noticed. It was written into her DNA like a serial number. 12 years of Navy Special Operations medical meant you learned to trust your eyes, to verify what you saw, to document it in ways that left no room for bureaucratic wiggle room. She'd kept people alive in Kandahar by trusting that detail, by understanding that protocol wasn't red tape, it was the difference between a clean kill and friendly fire. And that made her a problem. Pierce needed the discrepancies to stay invisible. Not even invisible, he needed them to exist in that gray space between legitimate pharmaceutical practice and inventory oversight, where a pharmacy tech might shrug and assume it was human error, where an auditor might assume it was a clerical mistake that would balance out eventually. People who cared about whether 5 milliliters of methadone actually made it to a patient didn't belong in that space. Laura understood the architecture of it now. She'd seen similar structures in Kandahar, watched them operate, the flow of contraband goods, the way power cascaded downward through a chain of mutual vulnerability, each person holding something on the next person so that nobody could afford to talk. Kickback schemes were just the military supply corruption with pharmaceutical licensing attached. She reached for her phone. Personal phone, not the hospital network. Pierce had already flagged her access to restricted files once. But the evidence was there in the terminal, displayed on the screen in columns of numbers that told the story plainly. She photographed each discrepancy screen, the visitor logs, the correlated dates. 6 photos. 12. 20. Each one a brick in a wall that was about to collapse on someone. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like insects trapped in a cage. Laura saved the files to a secure cloud folder, the same one she used for encrypted communications with the Pentagon contact who'd warned her that her identity had been flagged, then forwarded the documentation to the hospital's compliance officer, to the State Board of Nursing, to the DEA's Pharmacy Oversight Division. It took 4 minutes. Clean. Documented. Deniable, if anyone decided to deny it, because she was using her personal accounts, leaving no digital trace on hospital systems. She should have felt satisfied. Instead, she felt the weight of a door closing somewhere above her. The monitor in room 304 beeped its steady rhythm. Thomas Mitchell slept now, sedated, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythm that should have been impossible 3 hours ago. His father had finally released the bed rail and moved to the uncomfortable chair in the corner, his eyes tracking every monitor, every 4 bag, the way a sentry watches a perimeter. He'd asked no more questions. He understood that some things moved on channels that didn't have words for civilian language. Laura checked the medication drip one final time. Dose correct. Rate appropriate for a child with the complications he carried. Everything by protocol. Everything documented. Everything defensible in court, in a board hearing, in whatever venue opened up when the ground finally gave way beneath Dr. Pierce's careful structure. The night deepened. 4:30 a.m. The ICU was quieter now, the way hospitals got in the hours before dawn, when the machines did most of the talking and the living stayed very still. Laura moved through it like a shadow, adjusting settings, replacing lines, reading the small adjustments the body made, understanding that healing wasn't dramatic. It was incremental. It was patient. It was 10,000 small decisions made right instead of one grand gesture made wrong. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that the evidence she'd sent out into the world would take time to ripple through bureaucracy, that Pierce had hours, maybe a full shift, before anyone official started asking questions. The worst part was understanding that she'd just forced the narrative to an accelerated timeline, that by documenting his scheme, by sending that evidence upstream, she'd announced herself as a threat. Not as a nurse who'd noticed something. As someone who understood institutional corruption well enough to track it, document it, weaponize it. The worst part was that Pierce would eventually realize that too. She was still thinking about that at 5 a.m., when her phone buzzed silently in her pocket and she saw the message from the encrypted Pentagon line, flagged status escalated. Maintain position. Stand by for extraction protocol. Not an extraction yet. Just a warning that it was coming. That the window was closing. That Laura Bennett, the quiet nurse pushing a medication cart through the Colorado Springs night, was about to stop being quiet. She checked Thomas Mitchell one more time. His color was good. His oxygen saturation holding at 96. His father was finally asleep, head tilted at an angle that would hurt his neck in the morning, but the man needed rest. He'd been carrying his son's weight for 8 years, since the car accident that had shattered the boy's spine, and some people's strength was so complete that it looked like a burden. Some people loved like warfare. Laura understood that language. She was back at the medication cart when the overhead intercom crackled, Code Blue, Trauma Bay 1. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 1. Not her patient. Not her responsibility. But her feet were already moving toward the sound, because that was what training did. It rewired the autonomic nervous system, made your body respond to emergency the way other people's bodies responded to their own names. She'd be there. She'd help. And Dr. Pierce would see her help, would watch her perform at the level that nobody who'd finished nursing school last year should be able to perform at. The evidence was in the system now, rippling upward through agencies that moved with glacial bureaucratic precision. But this moment in the next room where someone's heart had stopped, this moved at the speed of physics and muscle memory and the kind of knowledge that only lived in people who'd already seen the worst. The code team was minutes out. The patient was arrested. And Laura Bennett walked toward the sound of the flatline like she was walking toward the only truth that had ever mattered. Everything else was just noise. The flatline was a sound Laura Bennett had heard in her nightmares for 7 years. It wasn't the monitor's electronic shriek that made her move, it was the silence underneath it, the absence of a heartbeat, the collapsing of all possibility into a single urgent moment. She was 3 doors down from room 304 when the alarm triggered, and her feet were already moving before her conscious mind registered the decision to run. Thomas Mitchell's chest heaved once, twice, then stopped. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm into a void that no longer knew how to receive it. His oxygen saturation had been dropping all evening. She'd watched it drift from 96 to 92 to 88 despite the increased FiO2, his small body struggling against something the day shift monitors had missed. Laura had documented it. Charted it. Left 3 notes for the night resident who'd never called her back. Now, at 2:06 a.m., his collapsed lung was creating pressure against his heart, and the boy who'd looked at her with eyes older than 8 was about to die because the system had failed him. She didn't run. She walked. That was the discipline talking, muscle memory that lived deeper than panic, training that had kept her alive through 3 Kandahar deployments. Run and you lose control. Walk and you own the moment. The ICU doors opened before her, her badge still functional, her clearance still valid, her identity still a secret that was burning underneath her skin like a brand. The code team was converging, 2 residents, a respiratory tech, the night charge nurse. They moved with the careful uncertainty of people who'd never really had to save a life under fire. Laura pushed past them to the bedside. "What's his presentation?" Her voice was flat. Informational. Not a question but a download request. One of the residents started talking. Desaturating despite. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. He's got tension pneumo. Not a diagnosis. A statement of fact delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who'd performed this procedure on corpsmen, on SEALs, on civilians bleeding out in dust and diesel fumes. Her hands were already moving. Gloves from the box. No time for ceremony. No time for uncertainty. Just the 14-gauge angiocath needle, just the pressure, just the knowing exactly where to go because anatomy was the same whether you were 8 years old or 18 or 42. The boy's ribs were thin beneath her fingers. She found the space with the precision of a lockpicker finding the correct tumbler. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that beautiful, terrible sound of pressure releasing, of a lung re-inflating, of a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. 1 moment. That's all it took. The monitor chirped. Once. Twice. The rhythm came back like a prayer being answered. Push 1 milligram epi 4, she said to the respiratory tech, who was staring at her with something between awe and confusion. Get me a trauma shear for the chest tube kit. And call surgery, he needs a proper evaluation for the thoracic cavity. No one questioned her. That was the moment she understood her mistake. That was the precise second when composure became visibility, when competence became a confession, when she stopped being just a nurse and became something else entirely, right there at the bedside, her hand still steady, her mind already 3 steps ahead, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd made these decisions before, who'd owned the outcome, who'd never once second-guessed herself even when the patient survived against statistics. Thomas Mitchell's eyes fluttered. His oxygen saturation climbed. 94, 97. 99, the numbers going the right direction. The numbers that meant he was coming back from the edge. And Dr. Pierce was in the doorway. He'd arrived before the code team even dispersed, his phone already to his ear, his face carrying the expression of someone who'd just watched a chess piece move itself. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been simpler. His eyes were calculating, measuring, already 3 moves ahead of his own, already building the narrative that would explain why a pediatric ICU nurse had just performed an emergency needle decompression with the competence of a naval special operations medical officer. "Gentlemen," Pierce said, his voice smooth as oil on still water. He stepped fully into the room. "Nurse Bennett, you've done excellent stabilization work here. Excellent. The code team is taking it from here." He turned to the residents. "I'll want to see everyone involved in her shift in my office by 0600. There are some protocol concerns we need to document." he was already dialing on his phone. His second line. His third call in as many minutes. Carolyn? Yes, it's Pierce. I need 2 things at St. Michael's before the shift change. I need her badge flagged in the system for unauthorized medication access and patient boundary violations. And I need security standing by in my office. I'm going to need witnesses. Laura didn't move. She watched the numbers on Thomas's monitor. 99, stable. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the discipline of standing still while someone tried to bury you alive, of knowing that fighting back would make the hole deeper. It was the knowledge that she'd just revealed herself to someone who had every reason to destroy her before anyone could ask the questions that her competence had already answered. The code team dispersed. The night charge nurse gave her a look that said everything, gratitude and terror and the dawning realization that something was fundamentally wrong with the story they'd all been told about who Laura Bennett actually was. She stayed at Thomas's bedside, adjusting his ventilator settings, checking his full lines, doing the small careful work of keeping a child alive, because that's what she'd been trained for, and that's what she would do until they made her stop. Dr. Pierce remained in the doorway. Watching. Calculating. His phone had already moved on to the next call, something about board allies and liability concerns and a nurse whose file was about to become very, very complicated. 53 minutes later, Laura was walking down the corridor with 2 security guards. She knew them both. Mike and Derek. They'd taken their breaks with her on the loading dock while it rained, and their faces now carried that particular helplessness of people who had no choice in what was being asked of them. Mike held a printed document. A fabricated cascade of disciplinary flags, unauthorized medication inquiries, boundary violations with patients, protocol deviations that hadn't existed when she'd clocked in. The timestamps were recent. The last one was from 3:22 a.m., just minutes after Thomas Mitchell's heart had started beating again. Nurse Bennett, Mike said, and his voice was genuinely sorry. Your badge is being deactivated immediately. Administrative leave pending investigation. You'll need to collect your personal items. Her locker was small. The cracked mug her sister had sent 3 years ago from Oregon. The dying succulent on the shelf, a plant that refused to accept that its soil had turned to dust, that the light was never quite enough, that some things survived through sheer spite rather than any actual nourishment. The photograph in its plastic frame. Her swim buddy. Marcus Chen. The one who'd gone back in for the civilians when he should have run. The folded flag from his funeral, white and red, tucked behind the photo like a secret. She placed each item into the cardboard box Derek had brought. Her movements were methodical. Careful. The discipline holding her together like a scaffold. The rain outside was the kind that fell horizontally, like it had a destination and no patience for anything standing in its way. Laura sat at the bus stop at 3:06 a.m., cardboard box on her lap, watching the water cascade down the shelter's plastic walls. The fluorescent lights of the hospital glowed like dying stars in the distance. Thomas Mitchell was stabilized. His chest was rising and falling. His heart was beating in the pattern that meant he would probably survive this night, probably survive tomorrow, probably grow up never knowing that the quiet nurse with steady hands had been a Navy captain, that she'd been trained by SEAL Team 3, that she'd operated in environments where mistakes meant flag-draped coffins. Her phone buzzed. An email notification. Dr. Pierce had sent a hospital-wide message citing patient safety concerns, expressing regret that a team member had demonstrated such profound lapses in judgment, recommending termination and possible board complaint. No mention of the needle decompression. No acknowledgement that she'd saved a life. Just the narrative he'd already prepared, the story that would stick to her like scar tissue. She couldn't defend herself. Couldn't explain that the protocol violations were non-existent, that the medication discrepancies she'd discovered were his scheme, not hers, that she was a captain in the United States Navy and had performed emergency medicine in classified operations in Kandahar province under the direct command of flag officers whose names she wasn't allowed to speak. The rain hammered the shelter roof like applause. The cardboard box grew wet at the corners. Inside, the photograph of Marcus Chen gradually absorbed moisture, and the folded flag underneath it began to wilt, the crisp white fabric starting to soften under the weight of weather and time and the irreversible damage that happens when things meant to be honored are forced to hide in cardboard boxes at 3:22 a.m. in Colorado Springs. She could walk away. She could get on a bus heading anywhere, disappear into the civilian world the way she disappeared into this hospital, and let Thomas Mitchell grow up without ever knowing his name. But that thought lasted exactly as long as it took for her phone to buzz again. Not an email this time. A text. From a blocked number. Phoenix call sign compromised. Recommend immediate relocation. Status check required. The Pentagon. Already watching. Already knowing that whatever she'd just done in room 304 had triggered every alert in the classified security system, had sent flags up through channels so compartmentalized and protected that most of the government didn't even know they existed. They wanted her to run. That was the message underneath the message. That was the order disguised as a suggestion. She looked toward the hospital. One window on the 4th floor was still lit. The pediatric ICU. Where a child with a shattered spine was breathing because of her hands, because of the training she was supposed to forget, because she'd made the decision that some codes are more important than security protocols and some lives matter more than disappearing. In 23 minutes, the morning shift would arrive. In 42 minutes, Captain Mitchell would push through the hospital doors demanding answers about the nurse who'd saved his son. In 84 minutes, everything that had been carefully constructed would begin to collapse. But for now, there was only rain, and cardboard, and the folded flag of a man who would never know that she'd kept her promise. The rain had stopped by 07:45 when the FBI agents walked through the emergency department doors at St. Michael's, their credentials clipped to Navy windbreakers, their movements carrying the precision of people who'd practiced this particular choreography hundreds of times. The lead agent, Special Agent Holloway, 52, with the carved face of someone who'd spent a career watching criminals unravel, carried a warrant that had been signed at dawn. They'd been tracking Dr. Pierce's pharmaceutical kickback scheme for 6 months, watching the pharmacy logs bloom with suspicious orders, the medication quantities climbing in patterns that had nothing to do with patient census and everything to do with Dr. Pierce's relationship with a pharmaceutical rep named Marcus Venn, a man who'd been depositing $40,000 monthly into 3 different accounts under false business names. The stamp on the warrant read Federal Conspiracy to Distribute Controlled Substances. Laura stood in the pediatric ICU with Captain Mitchell when she heard the commotion ripple down the hallway, that particular kind of silence that descends just before something breaks. The sound of boots on tile. Multiple footsteps. The authority in someone's voice, Dr. Edmund Pierce. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Mitchell's hand tightened on the wheelchair handles where his son sat, the boy's eyes tracking the nurses who suddenly froze mid-stride, mid-charting, mid-everything. Pierce had been in his office. They knew exactly where he'd be, his routine was algorithmic, his office the one place he'd disappear during morning hours to make phone calls and review the day's medication requisitions. The agents found him at his desk, coffee cooling in a ceramic mug, his computer screen still glowing with the pharmacy ordering system. When Special Agent Holloway read him his rights, Pierce's face cycled through colors, first the red of indignation, then the white of comprehension, then something closer to the gray of a man watching his entire architecture collapse in real time. "This is a misunderstanding," Pierce said, his voice taking on the edge of desperation. "I was protecting patient safety. The medication orders were justified by clinical need." But the agents had already found the burner phone in his desk drawer. They'd already photographed the text exchanges with Marcus Venn. They'd already pulled the timestamps showing when Pierce had fabricated Laura's disciplinary files, the records altered 48 hours after she'd begun documenting medication discrepancies, the false documentation created with surgical precision, each entry timestamped but showing manipulation signatures that only appeared when records were edited after the fact. The system had flagged it. The federal system, the one that nobody was supposed to bypass. The one Pierce had believed he controlled. "You also falsified medical records to obstruct an investigation," Holloway said, holding up the printout. "The employee files you created for Laura Bennett. They don't exist in the original system. You added them after the timestamps show she began reviewing pharmaceutical logs. That's conspiracy, obstruction, and tampering with federal evidence. Pierce's jaw clenched. She was going to expose. Yes, Holloway said. She was. That's called doing her job. The handcuffs came out. They were stainless steel, polished to a shine that caught the fluorescent light. Pierce held out his wrists with the muscle memory of someone who'd watched countless arrest scenes on television but had never imagined himself as the subject. The metal clicked closed with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The perp walk happened in the main corridor. Residents stopped charting. Nurses turned from medication dispensers. An attending physician stood frozen with a chart in his hands, watching Pierce shuffle past with agents on either side. His face was red, not the commanding red of a surgeon in control, but the mottled red of humiliation, of exposure, of being walked through your own dominion in handcuffs. Sweat darkened his collar. He stumbled on the tile once, caught himself with the indignity of a falling man grabbing at invisible rope. Laura watched from the pediatric ICU entrance, standing beside Captain Mitchell. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Her face held the kind of neutral expression that comes from years of processing information while the room watched you, the same expression she'd maintained during grand rounds and vending machine threats and every other moment when showing emotion would have cost more than she had to give. But Mitchell was watching her? His eyes tracked the smallest shift in her posture, the way her breathing didn't change, the way her hands remained steady at her sides. He turned to her slowly, understanding beginning to crystallize across his face like frost forming on glass. That's what you were protecting him from, Mitchell said quietly. Not patient safety. Your silence. Laura turned to look at him. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone choosing to tell the truth after carrying it alone for so long. The medic who replaced me in Kandahar. In the operation that officially never happened. She paused. He was your brother. Mitchell's expression fractured. He looked away, toward the hallway where agents were loading Pierce into an unmarked sedan. He looked down at his son, who was watching the chaos with the serious eyes of a child who'd learned early that adults didn't always make sense. He looked back to Laura. He wrote about you, Mitchell said. His voice had gone thin, stretched tight over something enormous. In letters home. He called you Phoenix. He said if he ever met you, he'd thank you for training him so well that he knew exactly how to do the job right. Mitchell swallowed. He did the job right. Right up until he didn't have the choice to do anything else. The boy in the wheelchair reached out without speaking. His small hand caught the edge of Laura's scrubs. Laura looked down at the 8-year-old, Thomas, Captain Mitchell's son, the boy whose spine was fractured and healing and would heal more, the boy whose eyes had seen his father's worst fear realized and was now watching the man who'd nearly erased the person who saved him being led away in handcuffs. Thank you, the boy said. 2 words. That was all. Laura's hand came down and rested gently on his head. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say. The pharmaceutical rep, Marcus Venn, was arrested in the parking lot 30 minutes later, trying to get into his BMW with a car wash receipt still in his jacket pocket showing he'd been preparing his life for flight. The FBI found $43,000 in the trunk, bound in stacks, the kind of money that gets packaged when you're planning to disappear. 6 months later, the seasons had turned. Colorado Springs had cycled through spring and into early summer, and Laura Bennett's office overlooked the mountains with the kind of clarity that comes from height and clean air and the absence of anything to hide from. The nameplate on her door read Director of Emergency Medicine. The office walls held commendations that had finally, after Pentagon declassification made it possible, come out of the darkness: a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, a Navy Commendation Medal. Each one displayed without context, without explanation, just the facts of a career rendered in ribbon and metal. The folded flag sat in a drawer beside her desk. Not hidden anymore. Not contraband. Not the kind of object you kept because you couldn't destroy it but couldn't bear to see it. Thomas Mitchell had asked about the photograph during her follow-up appointment, the one showing a young woman in desert fatigues with a man whose smile held the particular quality of someone who'd learned to find joy in impossible situations. Laura had told him the story then. She'd told Captain Mitchell. She'd told them both about the medic, about Kandahar, about the operation that the congressional inquiry had finally declassified after the FBI investigation into Pierce's crimes had required her classified history to become evidence. The truth had been difficult. It was always difficult. But it had been better than the weight of carrying it alone. Thomas walked into her office using forearm crutches, his spine healing ahead of projections, the neurologists amazed at the rate of his recovery, as if spinal regeneration could be accelerated by proximity to someone who'd already survived things that weren't supposed to be survivable. His father accompanied him, Captain Mitchell's hand steady on his son's shoulder. The boy carried a drawing. He'd been in art therapy, processing the crash through color and line, and this one showed a figure with wings, labeled in careful letters, Phoenix. Laura took it and set it on her desk beside the folded flag. At the monthly staff meeting in August, she stood in front of the pediatric team and addressed protocol adherence and patient advocacy. Her voice had changed. It carried an authority now that the world could finally see, a composure born not from hiding but from standing openly in who she'd always been. The new pharmaceutical compliance officer presented updated tracking systems, safeguards designed to prevent another Pierce, another scheme, another moment when a nurse could notice something wrong and be destroyed for it. Laura listened to the presentation, then stood and spoke to the room. Rules exist to protect the vulnerable, she said. Not the powerful. When you see something wrong, you're obligated to report it. Not to your supervisor. Not to your administrator. To the people designed to protect the system itself. And if the system doesn't protect you back, then the system is broken and needs to be rebuilt. The room stayed quiet. That particular silence that descends when people realize they're listening to someone who's been through the worst of what systems do to people and is still choosing to believe systems matter. Thomas and his father stood in the doorway. Captain Mitchell had his hand on his son's shoulder, and the boy was watching Laura with eyes that seemed to understand something essential about what it meant to be invisible and then, suddenly, to be seen. The boy approached her after the meeting. He handed her a piece of folded paper. "I wrote this," he said. "For the person my medic uncle talked about." He opened it and read, his voice steady, "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." Laura took the paper. She understood then that the boy had been listening, all along, to the stories his father had told, the legacy his uncle had left, the meaning hidden in a call sign and a photograph and a medal buried in darkness for 18 years. Dr. Pierce, out on bail awaiting trial, drove a medical supply van now, minimum wage, morning shift, loading and unloading boxes in weather that couldn't distinguish between a former attending physician and any other delivery driver. Laura saw him once through her office window, soaked from rain, struggling with a carton. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt something closer to symmetry. The man who'd tried to silence her was now driving through Colorado Springs invisible, ordinary, trapped in the same kind of erasure he'd attempted to inflict on someone else. That was better than satisfaction. That was justice configured as geometry. If you've ever been invisible in a room full of people watching you, if you've ever stayed quiet because speaking cost too much, if you've ever wondered whether standing up would matter, I need you to know something. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. And in the comments, tell me, what would you do if you finally had permission to be seen?